This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Stay tuned to learn more about them later in the video. There are many amazing duos in Game of Thrones, most of which have the baggage of the later seasons, but the Hound and Arya are a perfect pairing that tells an effective and endearing story. So let's go in depth and analyze them with 6 reasons as to why they are one of, and if not the best duo in Game of Thrones. To start, let's go into how their duo acts as an interesting twist on a popular character pairing archetype. This archetype is specifically an older character taking care of a younger character, and through their journey, they create a powerful bond. This is a pretty popular archetype, especially from what we've seen recently, like with the first season of The Last of Us, The Mandalorian, or these handful of movies. Obviously, Game of Thrones seasons 3 and 4 came out before some of these, but this is all to point out how heavily this general archetype can carry a given story. This inherent dynamic is engrossing because it displays synergized character growth for 2 people simultaneously. Now, for Game of Thrones, George R. R. Martin takes this archetype and flips it on its head. What if our protagonist is forced into a relationship like this, but it's instead with an antagonist? Most examples of this archetype are 2 separate protagonists coming together, and it's extremely rare when you have this pairing form with a villain. The only example I can think of currently is Arcane Season 1, where Jinx forms a bond with Silco, but most of that development isn't shown on screen. For Sandor and Arya though, we get over a season of this development, and it's riveting throughout. It's extremely difficult writing a realistic and compelling narrative that has a villain and a protagonist bond in this manner. Although, to be fair, Sandor isn't a main villain, and I classified him as a side antagonist. However, even though he's a side antagonist, Arya still thoroughly hates Sandor in the beginning.
I'm gonna put a sword through your eye and out the back of your skull.
It's kind of interesting watching some of their first encounters because you'd think this would be foreshadowing their endpoints, but it does the opposite where we are first establishing a point from which we can develop greatly. So at a fundamental level for Arya and Sandor, the fact that they have this rift creates immense complexity for their relationship as to why they're drawn together, and their growth is strewn with great conflict. Arya is repulsed by so many of Sandor's actions, but yet she not only needs him in a physical sense, and more so because there's a plethora of deeper layers that draws Arya to Sandor. The first one being that he's an excellent fighter in which through him, she can get proxy revenge and satisfaction. Like her being able to kill Polliver because of him. He kind of indirectly activates Arya's bloodlust and allows her to scratch names off of her list. On her own, this simply wouldn't be possible. Another one is that Arya just lost her entire family and Sandor kind of becomes the only person she has left. I wouldn't flat out call Sandor her father figure, but a more twisted and dark version of what a parent should be. This is a relationship forged in tragedy in which Sandor can't help but kind of look after Arya. There are traces of compassion within his character, and given that his past is laden with trauma as well, I think this creates a desirable source for him to sympathize with Arya. Also, thematically, it's kind of interesting how the Hound and the Wolf are pairing together in this regard. Then a third aspect is how Sandor challenges Arya's worldviews. He tears down her idols, dismantles the notion of knights being honorable, and in general awakens Arya to the harsh realities of Westeros. Sandor is brutally honest to Arya. He kind of acts as a teacher since everyone before Sandor has sheltered her. It's the same dichotomy Sansa has with Littlefinger, where most of the lessons she learns derives from their relationship and experience together. However, Littlefinger is much more sociopathic than Sandor. So for Arya, this further drives her to look up to Sandor as this parental figure because she's never had anyone treat her in this bold yet truthful way. Honesty is a core tenet from which strong relationships are built. Then finally, Sandor simply enables Arya to be what she wants in life. Even her own father, until they were finally in King's Landing, started to accept that Arya didn't want to be a lady. While for Sandor, his roughness kind of meshes with Arya's inherent resilience and molds her into what she needs to be to survive in this world. She obviously doesn't get to literally be a knight, and I think this general lifestyle is what's appealing to her right now. You can especially feel her satisfaction at certain parts of their journey. She's actually pretty happy, all things considered, and even though Sandor can do some things that enrage Arya, she comes to accept his inherent flaws. At the end of the day, there's much worse than Sandor out there, and I love this sentiment because it highlights how morally corrupted most people are in this world. I can probably go into more minor aspects that draw them together, like their escalating sense of respect and trust, and there's genuinely a lot to be analyzed under the surface for their relationship. It's the true embodiment of a subtextual dynamic where the characters never say what's actually on their minds and how they feel about one another. This is an example of great writing and how you write characters with actual nuance. George R. R. Martin unlocks this by taking an already great character pairing archetype and infuses it with a new twist that makes it even more interesting. This in general is his entire philosophy when it comes to writing Game of Thrones. The story is riddled with George subverting tropes and archetypes, like killing your main character or having the good guys lose the war. So even at a smaller scale for writing this narrative, it's crazy that George is still reinforcing this philosophy and thus making the story even more iconic. For the next point that essentially synergizes with the first one in terms of this pairing being an archetype, that also means that both Arya and Sandor have a captivating co-aligning arc. It's impossible to not mention this because that is fundamentally what makes their journey so compelling. Character growth and arcs are the lifeblood of storytelling. You can immediately tell when a story is bad because the character development is lacking, or sometimes said main character doesn't really have a tangible arc. Arya and Sandor, on the other hand, they're drastically different from when they started this journey. And it's especially more intriguing because the way they interact with each other impacts how their own arcs play out. Like, the more Sandor spends time with Arya, the more his compassion bleeds through his heavy armored exterior, and each of these moments acts to endear Arya to his character. Like, initially she thinks she's going back to King's Landing, so right away her expectations are shattered, and they progressively keep getting subverted throughout their arc. Also, it isn't like Sandor is a flat-out misunderstood good guy, because he is still very flawed and lives through a brutal worldview. It constantly forces Arya into a very complicated relationship with Sandor, and there's just enough alluring aspects under the surface that draws her to him. Sandor is also probably a character that has never been in a real relationship before, so seeing him form a rapport in which he actually cares about another human being is miraculous. It makes his character pretty lovable because unlocking that personal humanity makes the audience heavily sympathize with him. It's kind of the ultimate arc and is done a lot throughout cinema. A character who's seemingly worn down and is devoid of compassion, moving to a point of rekindling the dormant warmth inside of them. It's such a popular formula and is so absorbing because it allows the audience to deeply connect with the character, along with us genuinely wanting the best for Arya given that she's gone through utter tragedy. So if anything, I think Sandor has the stronger and more resounding arc as opposed to Arya. His ending is enormously triumphant, and him declaring he's her protector and fighting Brienne is such a massive moment of payoff. How did a character who seemingly doesn't care about anyone get to a point of being willing to fight a daunting warrior to the death for them? I know Sandor probably thinks he'll win, but prior to this, his competition wasn't exactly that intimidating. This point in the plot acts to perfectly punctuate Sandor's ending with Arya. Then for her arc is a bit more nuanced. It plays into the complexities of her inner motivations of being drawn to Sandor, but the primary evolution is, how can a character who's on her list of people she wants to kill end up becoming someone she admires? While also still balancing an inkling of hatred for them since Sandor is fundamentally not a good guy. Like, their ending is such a masterclass of a scene. It feels like there's this complicated mixture of hate and sympathy, leading to a point where Arya doesn't actually want to kill Sandor, but she still wants him to endure some form of punishment. And then Sandor leaning into his vulgar persona, something that he used to do a lot in the beginning to provoke Arya, and that no longer working is just brilliant. Again, showing how these characters have grown, and when that doesn't work, Sandor stoops down and begs. Such a gutting moment, and reveals a dire vulnerability in their relationship. Really, every scene Arya and Sandor have together expertly conveys so much information and character development. It's why their scenes are so mesmerizing, because it's the personification of a great journey of growth. Before moving on to the next point, let's talk about today's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the ultimate platform for entrepreneurs to stand out and succeed online. Anything you can think of for a website like a wedding, store, portfolio, or something more creative like making a website for your mom for Mother's Day, Squarespace has you covered. The process of making a website may seem daunting, but it's extremely simple given that there are a plethora of great template designs to choose from. Or you can even use their built-in Blueprint AI system to tailor a website to your needs. Also, if you want to secure your own custom domain, you can easily register that through Squarespace. There are genuinely a lot of applications for using their service, and if you're interested in trying them out, then head to squarespace.com and use my discount code SupercutsDelight to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now let's get back to the video. Moving on to the next aspect that highlights this great duo is that, through Sandor's pairing with Arya, it unlocks a new perspective from which we view his character. We're no longer witnessing him as the Hound, and instead someone with humanity. Throughout those first 2 seasons, we think he's predominantly a sadistic brute, and that's occasionally contradicted by him protecting Sansa, which insinuates that there's more going on and gives him a bit of intrigue. This highlights that Sandor isn't purely evil, and there is some light hidden under his burnt surface. So for his adventure with Arya, this allows George to explore that more tender side of Sandor. One of my favorite scenes that showcases this is Arya cleaning his neck bite. Here, we finally have these characters opening up, and it goes to show that Sandor telling Arya about his traumatic past with Gregor is a big deal. This is a character that's very closed off, and given this particular situation where Arya is trying to burn away his flesh, he decides to disclose this. Keep in mind that this doesn't happen in the books, and the only way we hear about this there is Sandor getting drunk and spilling all of this to Sansa, which he obviously regrets. So I think this is a clever way that David and Dan came up with to extract the truth from Sandor in a natural way. Prior to this, all we had were rumors from Littlefinger which we obviously assumed were true, but hearing it come from Sandor adds a more devastating and heartbreaking flavor to his backstory. This scene adds a huge amount of sympathy that not only Arya feels towards Sandor, but also the audience and our perceptions towards him. This moment and other scenes that highlight his more compassionate side drastically recontextualizes his character, which I think is so engrossing. It subverts the audience's expectations and acts as its own mini twist for who Sandor really is under his Hound persona. It's kind of why he's one of my favorite characters, because throughout those first 4 seasons, we're receiving a lot of detailed development that acts as this complicated jigsaw puzzle for figuring out who he really is. So having this newfound perspective with Arya's duo, it gives us all the hidden pieces that were alluded to throughout the show. Another point that is done so expertly is the non-overbearing humor between these characters. It's actually kind of impressive because there's quite a bit of it, and it never gets old or annoying. Which, looking at other duos, the humor becomes extremely grating.
Because you have no...
However, I think the overall ironic pairing between them does a lot of heavy lifting. They're constantly butting heads, and this leads to a lot of natural circumstances for these characters to make funny remarks.
He killed Lummy.
What the fuck's a lummy?
Especially Sandor, who's frequently getting annoyed and is making harsh yet hilarious quips. Like that entire scene where Arya's practicing and Sandor is standing on the sidelines like a disgruntled, diabolical, drunk soccer mom is comedic gold.
Who taught you that shite?
Which, looking away from the writing for a second, Rory McCann is doing an amazing job delivering hilarious lines with the most serious and deadpan raspy voice. It drastically increases the caliber of this humor.
I understand that if any more words come pouring out your mouth, I'm gonna have to eat every fucking chicken in this room.
That's why I think Sandor is one of the characters who was the most resilient to David and Dan's poor writing. You can literally write any joke for this character to say, and it will undoubtedly be funny. Like, roasting humor in general isn't very difficult to write. However, for Tyrion as an example, his humor has to be witty and clever, and that's something that drastically drops off in the later seasons, and is kind of why his dynamic with Varys becomes insufferable. For Sandor, Since he is this brooding hulk of a man, his rapport with everyone creates this infectious dynamic where you eagerly await him to eviscerate them verbally, and then he also literally does so. But looking specifically at him and Arya, it is kind of like the elephant and the mouse dynamic. Arya knows deep down that Sandor won't actually hurt her, so this allows her to stand up and fight back with her own verbal jabs. If anyone else did this, then the Hound would snap them like a twig. This further makes their dynamic even more unique because this exclusive shared humor between them further increases their bond and makes them very likable. It makes it to where you could literally have a scene that's predominantly humor focused and it would never become overbearing. Because at the end of the day, most of their interactions highlight opposition, and that fundamental conflict between them is addicting to watch. While for other characters, the jabs just feel surface level and start to lose their efficacy over time. For the next point, I think this is a rare circumstance in which David and Dan actually elevate on the source material for Arya and Sandor's relationship. Primarily because there's not a lot of this duo featured in A Storm of Swords. We get about a few chapters of it, although some of those chapters are pretty dense, but it doesn't feel like their time together in that book lasts that long. Sandor would have died, quote unquote, at the end of season 4 during the fight at the inn if the show followed the same events of the book. Some moments are reshuffled a bit, and there were more points of development that happened prior to that fight. Now, the reason why their development wasn't that long is because that book is essentially seasons 3 and 4 sandwiched together. George physically didn't have enough space to give them more chapters because the latter half of that book is insanely crowded. You have the Red Wedding, Purple Wedding, and the Battle for the Wall all happening within like a handful of chapters from each other. So David and Dan naturally took that book and stretched it into 2 seasons. What this means is that we can now have an entire season that explores this duo in great length, thus giving their relationship more depth and time to develop and breathe. It's kind of interesting because Arya actually spends about double the time with the Brotherhood without banners than she does with the Hound. They spend multiple chapters trying to find Beric Dondarrion since in the books, they kind of divide and conquer and try to keep Beric's location a secret. David and Dan opt to cut out almost all of this and focus this narrative primarily on Arya running back into Sandor, which honestly, if it was between more Brotherhood without banners out in the road screen time, or more Sandor and Arya scenes, then I'd happily pick the duo since it's more substantial in terms of value it offers to the show. Another change I liked more is that Sandor isn't as aggressively hostile towards Arya. Or he still is, but as an example in the book, he regularly refers to Arya as she-wolf or wolf. Not sure if I can say that word because once I had an entire video demonetized for saying it once, so you know what I mean. His relationship with Arya is more vulgar and Sandor in general is much more induced with rage. Arya even describes the Hound as slipping into a cold rage for doing something as simple as chopping firewood, and he ends up getting so carried away that he chops 20 times what they needed. This toxic aura is a bit more prevalent in the book, and it seems like David and Dan slightly dampened this so that it's more believable for these two characters to grow closer. You can feel that Sandor has more respect and sympathy for Arya as opposed to the book. Or at the very least, it's a bit harder to pick up on that since we can't visually see facial expressions and hear deliveries. Another big change is obviously the end of season 4. Now, Brienne running into Arya is seemingly pretty lucky and acts as a coincidence, but it's at least plausible for these characters to run into each other in this area, since Brienne has suspicions about Arya being ransomed to the Vale. Just the way it's presented makes it seem like they chance into one another and bumfuck nowhere. So, logistics aside, this instead being the endpoint for Arya and Sandor's journey acts as better closure for their arcs. It more appropriately solidifies the bond these characters have formed over this longer period of time. I've already analyzed the ending of this arc earlier, but everything added in general is for the better and doesn't hurt the story. You genuinely can't go wrong by fleshing out an already great dynamic and giving it more screen time. Like, I could happily devour more scenes between Arya and Sandor. Going into the last point for these two characters, I want to specifically highlight their time in season 8 because from how terribly written everything was, I found their scenes to be at least tolerable. Which I'll dive into the writing in a bit, but first I love that there's a newfound sense of Sandor being happy that she's okay, which is essentially something we've never seen in his character, along with Arya also welcoming his presence once more. The fact that she left him for dead makes their reunion even more complex. There's visible tension as to if their first encounter is going to go poorly, but that hostile yet friendly Arya is slightly different because of the arc Sandor has gone through. His compassion has been brought to the surface more prominently, thus creating a newer and lighter dynamic with Arya. Their dialogue on the wall before the long night was the most real and vulnerable conversation they ever had. It's just extremely unfortunate that we didn't receive that many scenes between them that showcases this new dynamic. Like, one area that desperately needed more scenes with them was their journey to King's Landing. If David and Dan actually slowed down the pace, then I think this section could have at the very least made use of 2 scenes. One scene should be a situation playing out in a mirror-esque scenario, juxtaposing the past to the present, thus highlighting how our characters have changed through how they respond to the given encounter. This could be literally anything, as it would be used more as a device to show how our characters have grown. It would also be interesting if Sandor actually got to see Arya in combat, because that would lead to a fun dialogue scene, especially given the past where he railed her silly water dancing technique. Which, maybe this could be the beginning of the second scene where Sandor is curious about how lethal Arya is, so they have a sparring match. I'd much rather have it be between these 2 characters as opposed to it happening between her and Brienne. As mentioned, the interactions here would be priceless, but this would simmer down to a normal dialogue scene that I feel would be necessary for these 2 characters. This would take the confrontation they have in episode 5 about Arya's pursuit of vengeance and have it play out in depth prior to the battle. Have Sandor desperately try to convince Arya to drop this pursuit, and because of this, Arya is appalled and fundamentally disagrees with him, to which she would storm off alone to King's Landing. Also, maybe in a more ideal story environment, Dany's descent into madness is built up more and our characters are predicting shit to go down. So ideally, Sandor should clock that rushing Cersei in this manner would most likely result in her death. The way it is instead is just poorly written. Arya, a character that's consumed by revenge and has committed genocide, goes, "Oh yeah, you're right. I don't want to be like you and possibly get myself killed while trying to assassinate the person I've idolized killing throughout most of my life. My other endeavors, like storming the twins by myself, definitely wasn't more dangerous than this." It's just absurd, and having this confrontation take place before the battle is way more ideal. You can also possibly change their ending to where Sandor has to sacrifice himself to save Arya, which could act as a way to snap her out of this blind rage because she just got one of the people she's closest to killed. I know this devolved into me critiquing this dynamic, but I think David and Dan were close to creating a satisfying ending for this duo, along with just generally needing to write more scenes into these later seasons. But the very few interactions they did have were pretty solid. And all things considered, this duo plays out much better in comparison to pretty much all the others. So in general, between George twisting the character pairing archetype into something more unique and interesting, the brilliant and dynamic co-lining arcs, the new, warmer perspective that unlocks for Sandor, the great non-overbearing humor, and the fact that it's elevated from the source material and is able to resist the terrible quality of the last season, makes this the best duo in Game of Thrones. Let me know in the comments if you prefer other duos instead, because at the end of the day, this is just my opinion and there are a lot of great duos. Thanks for watching, and my Letterboxd, Discord, and Patreon links are in the description. Thanks to my incredible top patron, Logan Farmer.